We have been using jQuery and writing functions to put in our HTML page. And now we're going to look at adding parameters to that. So here's some review. We had a function that we defined in the script tag, and we used these jQuery calls in order to get the value out of an input text box with an ID of yard time. And then we use the jQuery to get the input text box with the ID of meter time, and in this case we were setting the value by passing in some data. And we were able to call that function by clicking the button because we added an attribute called onClick to our input button, and that calls the function convert to meters, which was the name of our function. In this case, these empty open and close parentheses indicate there are no parameters, so this function doesn't take any parameters. Let's take a look at a new example. Here we have a dive score calculator, and the snippet is of the page where we have different dives. It has a difficulty, and we can enter judges' scores, and then we want to calculate the diver's score for that particular dive when we press this calculate dive score button. So for the button on click, we tell it to call this function, and in the script tag we define this function. So it's very similar to what we did when we were calculating the temperature. Now we just have to get 4 values off the page instead of 1, and then we do our calculation on those values and write that result back to the page in our input text box that has the ID of dive 1 total score. So each of these pound values represent an ID that's on the page, and in this case we're getting the value, and then on the bottom we're setting the value. Well, we can actually add parameters to that function. Instead of hard coding in that this is dive 1 difficulty, we can give it a parameter name, and this is the second parameter. So if we look at the call, we can see the second value passed in is dive 1 difficulty. So it's doing the exact same thing as the last function, only we can substitute what the ID is when we go ahead to grab out the value. So for each of these cases, we have a parameter that corresponds to something being passed in. So score 1 is dive 1 score 1. Score 2 ID is dive 1 score 2, and so forth. And so we can pull those values off the page, calculate the result, and we also passed in the ID that we want to put the value into. And so here the first one is total score ID, and so we're getting the ID dive 1 total score and getting that object and setting its value to the total score. Now, a diver doesn't just dive one dive in a meet. The diver dives either 6 or 11 dives. So this example is for a 6-dive meet. And we want to be able to not just calculate the single dive score, but we want to calculate the grand total for the diver for the event. Since we've added parameters to our function, we can reuse that function for different input boxes. I also want to return the total score instead of just setting it on the page, because we want to get the total score for each dive so that we can sum it up and find the grand total. And so here is an example of how we might do that. So we have our button, and we're going to call calculate all dive scores. Well, you can see in our code we actually have 2 functions defined. We still have that same calculate dive score, but we're adding a new function called calculate all dive scores. And inside that function, we're going to reuse that calculate dive score to find each dive score. So for the first dive score, it's the same thing that we've used previously with all the dive ones. For the second dive score, we're just going to pass in the IDs from that second row in the table. Well, we can do that for all 6 dives. Once we've got the score for all 6 dives, we can write that grand total on the page. And that is your homework assignment. So this video will help you with your homework.